All right, so today for this Zoom session, session number 10, believe it or not, we are going to talk just briefly about the reading for this week's novel, and I'm going to make some suggestions and reiterate some points related to the conversation regarding the analysis essay. So we'll go ahead and start with that. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let's see here, share. And as you can see, today's session really involves a little bit of a preview and review of the threaded discussion for the week. So we had 2 threaded discussions last week, and if you have not yet had an opportunity to jump into those discussions, you can still do so this week. So I'm just going to preview that real quickly. So here we are. This is from last week. We had 2 discussions. So we had a session 4, session 7, session 9 discussion. Many people participated in the session 7 discussion from last week, which was just to compare the ways the Sixers operate within the Oasis to the way contemporary plagiarists operate online or in the larger marketplace. A lot of you made one of 2 arguments, that they were in fact like or akin to people who plagiarize because they pass their ideas up the chain, and that results in a negative feedback loop. That meaning is only that the results that come from this exchange of ideas on a corporate level stymies their progress. Now, this is directly in opposition to someone like Wade, who is operating as a lone character within the greater context of the Oasis. He is actually able to generate new and original thought, and that sort of elevates his status within the Oasis and enables him to make some successful strides forward that the corporate interests are not able to mete out as directly. Then the follow-up to that, have you ever been tempted to plagiarize yourself in real life? Many people said that they were tempted to plagiarize, but I'm happy to report that a lot of them didn't. And I had one very interesting exchange with a student who said that she was actually plagiarized by a fellow classmate in the past. So, and then here's my question. Here's my last question. If you were never tempted to plagiarize, which I think is wonderful, why do you feel that some students plagiarize in the first place? And a lot of students suggested that it was laziness. I got that answer quite frequently. And while I can't necessarily agree that I think it's laziness, I understand where students are coming from. And I would just tweak that a little bit and suggest that while I don't think it's laziness that drives the student to plagiarize, I think sometimes desperation will drive a student to look for a solution when they feel there is no time or there's no other recourse available. And sometimes that level of desperation can be reached as a result of a student procrastinating and not giving him or herself enough time to adequately address the needs of an assignment. So from that perspective, I could understand that there's a perception that some students are lazy and they turn to plagiarism out of that feeling. But I think it's more akin to desperation than, say, out and out laziness or not trying. Now for this week, I'm just going to scroll up a little bit here. If you have not yet a lot of students have already weighed in on this one too, but I'd like you to read Jasmine Fox's article, Is Social Media Killing Our Social Skills? And 3 tasks I'm asking you to complete are, number 1, to practice paraphrasing, meaning using your own words and sentence structure to convey the idea or argument, the core argument of our author, Jasmine Fox, right? What is her central argument? Use your own words to describe that. Then what evidence does she use to support this argument? And then thinking ahead to this week's assignment, how credible do you consider her sources? We were talking about this earlier at the top of the hour. Might there be better sources she could have used? Why or why not? So that's what I would like you to weigh in on this week if you haven't, like I said, had a chance to do so already. Okay, let's go back to the course homepage. There's not a whole lot else that I'm particularly worried about as we get ready to write this essay. But I will just go ahead and suggest that there is a question that you may want to ask yourselves when preparing this week, which is, what will my readers find interesting? So this is an important question, because asking yourself what your readers will find interesting casts a really wide net. You may find over time that it's easier to pare away certain elements from the discussion that your audience may find redundant, or that they may already have a strong background in. So one thing that, and I'm going to return to Madison's example. You were going to select the video game The Legend of Zelda. So when you're describing The Legend of Zelda as a game or a subject for analysis for this essay, it's going to be fairly appropriate to talk about the nature of how Zelda was developed, what kinds of new functions and features it introduced to the Nintendo Entertainment System, and perhaps even talk a little bit about the background of the story and the central characters. At least probably Zelda herself and Link, the sort of titular hero of the series, and probably even Ganon, the main villain. So that would all be appropriate, right? There is, at least for the auspices of this class and the structure for this particular essay, a supposition that a great majority of your readership may have never played Zelda. Even if they're a big gamer, they may not have played Zelda. And certainly if they were not a video game aficionado, essential background details would be important in order to facilitate their understanding of your analysis. So we talked last week about building certain criteria into the analysis of that essay. Madison, have you come up with a few focal points that you want to use to drive the engine of this review? Can you still hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, okay. I want to use the success of the game as in how many copies were sold, compare how many copies were made comparative to others. I want to use the fact that it's how easy it is to get into the game.
Okay.
But how challenging it is to complete the game. So like the amount of time you spend in the game comparative to other games of that time. And then I have to come up with another one.
Okay, and that's fine because this is drafting week. I didn't expect you to have everything laid out precisely, but you've got a really good start. So, to summarize, like success in sales essentially, and then playability. I mean, I know there are a lot of nuances involved in both of those two criteria that you described, but those are two good points of evaluation for a subject like the game. And you'll probably come up with a third criteria based on how successful you were and pointing out really good aspects to consider in terms of establishing the importance of the game.
I think the third one is the fact that the series is still around today.
Okay.
It's literally had, so the Legacy, it's literally had a variation on every single console that has come out since then.
Yeah, that's a great third, operating criteria. You've got then sales, playability, and then sustained success. So you've got three different distinct criteria that you can use when establishing reasons why that this stands as an important artifact from the 1980s, which is appropriate because the game at least was developed. I don't know how long its development, how far back its development goes, but it was released and very much appreciated in its era as an 8-bit game on a major system. And that is part and parcel of the world that builds the foundations of our text. So understanding why certain games attain prominence in society is critical to understanding why this book lays so much emphasis at the feet of this of popular culture from this era. And I would argue that part of what our author, Klein, is doing is not necessarily hiding in the past or crouching a story in the past because that's the popular fiction and that's the popular media of his day. That's true. That's certainly true. But he's also anticipating a kind of cyclical experience that we do know is part of how media functions in our society, which is the 30-year cycle of repetition. Now, if you watch the video about the upside of, or the upside down rather, of nostalgia, then you know what I'm referring to. Essentially, there is a theory in literary criticism and media criticism that suggests that every 30 years, the people who enjoyed a particular game, series, novel, or whatever, they find themselves after 30 years in a position to revisit these subjects from their youth, and they do so usually. Now, the 1980s seems particularly, to be of a fascination for creators of our current time frame. So the second decade of the 21st century. It's the 30-year mark after all, and for some things like 40 years. If you're going back to something like Star Wars. Now, we're probably right on the cusp of that phase ending and another phase beginning where we'll see some great appreciation for things that were popular in the 90s making a resurgence and being popular again. And I think that's a very likely scenario to play out. The 80s does seem to be lingering on a little bit, and we might see this 30-year cycle expanding just a little bit as people get used to economic shifts, because that's the other part of the phenomenon, right? Is that you have to have an audience with enough discretionary income to invest themselves into an appreciation of that media. So we don't necessarily have as much discretionary income being generated in the group of young people who were in their teens in the 1990s. They're still wrestling with that process. So we'll see how that unfolds in the next few years. Okay, so that's something I wanted to make sure that we talked about in terms of what your audience will find interesting. What are the core requirements that your particular topic needs to include in order to induce your audience into a sustainable readership for this particular topic? Because if you can find that, those core values and find that driving influence for them as readers, there's a really good chance that you will not only be successful as a writer, but that your essay will go on and live beyond the scope of perhaps even just this class. There may be other places where you can publish these ideas, either electronically or in reality, and there's certainly nothing wrong with making an attempt at that. Okay, real quickly, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to just broach the book. Okay, for this week, we had a couple of additional chapters to read, and those were chapters 9 through 13, I believe. Chapters 9 through 13. Okay, so in chapter 9, we really get a lot more about the relationship between Artemis and Wade. And we get some really interesting information, some background on Artemis. So she's officially introduced at the beginning of chapter 9. And I like the description of her avatar because, as we know from research done by social psychologists, men are very driven by visuals, okay? And so it's not just out of accident that we get this really detailed description of Artemis's avatar. However, it comes off in a way that I think is does accomplish the kind of sweet schoolboy version of what Wade is encountering, as opposed to like a tongue-lolling sycophant or something like that. He's not just reedifying, like, yes, this is what I wanted to, this is what I expected. He's not a yes man. But he says, first of all, we also get a real great introduction to her character, to Artemis's character, when she uses the very sort of striking phrase, "Who the hell are you?" she says. Or rather demands. The voice sounded like it belonged to a young woman and one who was itching for a fight. So right away you get a sort of cantankerous, no-nonsense idea of who she is as a character. And he goes on to say, when I failed to answer, a stocky female avatar stepped out of the shadows and into the chamber's flickering torchlight. She had raven hair, styled in Joan of Arc style short, and appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s. As she got closer, I realized that I knew her. And while we never actually met, I recognized her face from the dozens of screenshots she posted to her blog over the years. It was Artemis. She wore a suit of scaled gunmetal blue armor that looked more sci-fi than fantasy. Twin blaster pistols were slung low on her hips in quick-draw holsters, and there was a long, curved, elvish sword with a scabbard across her back. She wore fingerless Road Warrior style racing gloves and a pair of classic Ray-Ban shades. Another 80s icon that people have not written about for the purposes of this essay. So if you're watching this video in the future and you're still struggling with a topic, maybe Ray-Ban sunglasses might be a potential topic for you. Anyway, overall, she seemed to be going for a sort of mid-80s post-apocalyptic cyberpunk girl next door look. And it was working for me in a big way. In a word, hot. So we get a little bit of humor here. I thought that was a particularly funny exchange. While the book takes itself somewhat seriously, there are really fun moments like this that remind us that our narrator is a teenage male, and at some point in time, their worldview is limited, to say the least. They haven't had the official, full time to grow their prefrontal cortex, right? Again, we know from social psychologists that the prefrontal cortex in most human beings does not completely form until around the age of 22. So if we estimate the age Wade is about 17 or 18 years old, let's just put him at 18 for maximal potential development. He's pretty much outstrapped at this point by Artemis, because we know that in terms of the men and women and their development, women tend to be about 5 years ahead of their contemporary males most of the time. Not exclusively, but in a biological sense, they tend to be about 5 years developed. That's why the primary relationship status that we see amongst young people is who are looking for potential mates is about 5 years, right? So an 18-year-old female would probably be fairly typical for them to be dating a male up to or around the age of 23. That would be optimal, right? Obviously, there are a lot of variations and variables that would take place there, but we don't know much about Artemis and her relative age. We can assume that based on her dialogue with Wade, she might be a contemporary. And in point of fact, a little bit of a spoiler if you've seen the movie, she is a contemporary of Wade's. So they have a little exchange. They talk about the film Highlander, so on and so forth. And we see that they connect. And it's interesting in the way that they connect, because it's pretty clearly a fascination with the larger culture that they both appreciate. And they both seem comparatively awkward in their own various ways. So I think that this kind of meet cute chapter 9 here really does a nice job of establishing some of their dual interests. And then we get this really interesting exchange on page 97, where after a while, Artemis waits for the challenge, the Tomb of Horrors challenge with the Lich and the Joust game to reload. And they have some time to talk, shop, so to speak. And she asks, Wade, what would you do if you won? How would you spend all that money? And Wade, again, responds in a way that he hopes you would appreciate. But it's also pretty typically a juvenile male perspective. And he says that, I don't know, but generally I would move into a mansion, buy a lot of cool stuff, and just not be poor. And she says, wow, you're a big dreamer. And she says, well, okay, after you buy the mansion and all these things, what would you do with the estimated 130 billion that you have left over? And he says, I didn't want her to think I was shallow, so I blurted out some things I'd always dreamed of doing. And he takes a risk. He shares some information that he hadn't shared with anyone, and that would perhaps include even H at this point. And he said, I'd have a nuclear power spacecraft constructed in Earth's orbit, and then I would stock it with food and water and a self-sustaining biosphere and a supercomputer that was loaded with every form of media. And I invite a few of my closest friends along with a team of doctors and scientists, and we'd leave the solar system. So unfortunately, Wade has kind of given into this abandon your problems mentality that seems to be rampant in the worldview of the novel. And Artemis challenges him in a very appropriate way and says, that's pretty ambitious, but you do realize that you'd be leaving behind nearly half of the people on this planet to starve. And he says, I didn't detect malice in her voice. She sounded like she genuinely believed I may not be aware of that. And he says, he becomes defensive. Yes, I know. The reason so many people are starving is because we've wrecked the planet and the earth is dying. So it's time to leave. And she says, that's a pretty negative outlook. If I win, I'm going to try to make sure that everybody has enough to eat. And then once that problem is tackled, I can figure out how to fix the environment and solve the energy crisis. So is a real interesting dichotomy that's developed here, which is this fascination with escapism, which is the reason the whole Oasis and the entirety of this world is obsessed with it, is because it's so much easier to try to outlive a problem than turn around and take up the tools that are available to us and deal with them. And that's interesting because as this book is often criticized as being, continuing the trend of high fantasy that, focuses on so much of our attention today. There are elements within this book that sort of sabotage that base level reading, meaning that yes, it's a fantasy science fiction novel, but there are, as is true of the best science fiction, a lot of serious questions and challenges that are being leveled at the typical or perhaps even the atypical reader of such a novel, which is to say that we need to perhaps wake up a little bit more to the reality of the problems of a story like Ready Player One than get lost in the visual and high fantasy of the novel itself. And I thought that was a pretty interesting component. And this discussion concludes with Wade saying, he kind of rolls his eyes dismissively. He says, and after you pull off these miracles, you can genetically engineer a bunch of Smurfs and unicorns to frolic around the new world that you've created. But then she says, I'm being serious. And he asks her, do you really think it's that simple? You can just write a check for $240 billion and fix the world's problems. I don't know, Artemis says. Maybe it's not that simple, but I'm going to at least try. And then he says, if you win, that is. And she says, right, if I win. So I ask a question here. Is Wade waking up a little bit? Is he waking from this sort of somnambulist perspective, this dream-like perspective where he's just merely floating through life in the Oasis? He doesn't ask about the questions of the problem, but Artemis does. And this is very critical because if we return to the mythology of the story, we see a parallel between Parzival, his avatar name of choice, and the story of Percival, who is the knight of Arthurian legend. And part of his legend is tied to the principle of the Fisher King, which is means or in the Arthurian cycle refers to a king who, in addition to fishing all day, actually becomes grievously ill, and the land or the world around him becomes sick as well. And so we can see some real broad connections to the Arthurian mythology being played out here, whereas Wade does not think, or is not critically thinking enough about the consequences of potentially winning this contest as he should be. Then chapter 10 really into some of the elements. He finds out that after obtaining the key, he needs to open a gate. And so to do that, he revisits James Halliday's hometown and a recreation of his boyhood home. And he opens a key, or he completes a challenge rather, in a game called the Dungeons of Daggorath. And after the Dungeons of Daggorath occurs, there's a portal which opens, and he actually completes what is called a flick sync, which is a new kind of game that takes place within a film. So he's actually able to complete the dialogue of a particular film, this time War Games. All right, so then there is some more information about Halliday and Morrow in chapter 12. And he then reaches out to H, and they connect. And H has a warning for Wade, and he says, I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that IROC knows who you are. And in point of fact, as we will discover, that is going to be a problem. And then we find out that he receives a key to the next puzzle, and that's pretty much what this next portion has in store for us. So we'll meet again next time. Real briefly, I will probably, for the rest of this week, have posted Zoom sessions, but I won't, or sorry, let me say that again. I will have posted Zoom videos that you can watch and access, but I won't have an actual session Tuesday, or rather Wednesday or Thursday, because I just think that the likelihood of catching everybody with an available time frame during this holiday week is probably not very realistic. So I will post videos, but I won't have a Zoom session for Wednesday or Thursday this week. But if you do have questions, okay, I will be available all week, including Friday and the 4th as well, for email and individual conferences if you feel that you need them, or that you're out of options, or that you need a resource, or you need some help or assistance. Okay, any last questions or concerns, Madison, before we finish for today?
The due date for the paper.
Mm-hmm.
Is that this week or next week?
So the draft will probably be due. I think if I said it was Friday, because I realize that people might need a little bit of extra time this week. But in theory, it's usually the Thursday evening, the end of the week, for the draft week. Again, my operating idea was to make sure that you were, had some time available for family stuff and for the holiday.
Okay.
And it's always hard to predict holiday frameworks, because some people might work on, the holiday, and therefore have plenty of time, have more time during that actual day or frame, whereas people might be more interested in going on vacation or visiting someone or engaging in family activities during the actual holiday itself. So they might want to finish that work as a ramp up. So, there's no perfect scenario when we fall on a due date with a holiday weekend, but we'll try to make the best of it that we can, given our circumstances. I've already had one paper submitted, reviewing that. But that's a great question. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you for your participation today, and thanks to the rest of you who may be watching this in the future. If you have questions or concerns, as always, email me. Take care. Have a great day, and even better tomorrow.